president. Decided we were going to take our space, and what happened?
Yeah, and then I got into an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August,
An entanglement.
an entanglement with August. I got into an entanglement with August.
An entanglement.
With August, with August, with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August,
An entanglement.
with August, with August,
August.
entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement.
Good afternoon, everyone. You are live with King Sigma, and today is June 24th, 2020, or July 24th, 2020. And we'll be discussing the topic of marriage, the West, and the new normal within the context of living during this COVID pandemic, which many economists and futurists are saying is going to have dramatic impacts on the economy, on all of our social institutions, and of course, the individual. I decided to have this conversation because of a stream that Edward Anderson had last night. I caught the very end of it, maybe like the last 15 or 20 minutes right before I was going to bed. And I'm kind of just waiting for him to show up, but I'll give him like a minute or two. And so I'll just get started by reading the article. So this is definitely a conversation that's important for men that are between ages of 25 and particularly 35. Because the average age for marriage for men entering marriage in America right now is about 30 years old overall. And for Black men, it's probably closer to 35. So this is definitely a conversation that men that are millennials should be having more so than any other group, because it's your turn now. Whatever marriage is going to be defined as going forward is going to be defined by those that are definitely under 40 years old. And I have a lot of different views on marriage because I come from a family where most people were married, but almost all of them have been married multiple times. But when I look into my grandparents' generation, my grandparents, my great uncles, my great aunts, they were the ones that managed to stay married for, 25, 30 years or for the rest of their lives. But as we move into Generation X with my, obviously my father's generation, my mother's generation, my uncles and my aunts in that Gen X, that's when you see that breakdown where now no longer is the ideal of staying together, 10 years plus, 20 years plus. That's not an ideal once we hit the 80s and the 90s for sure. So for me, basically, my thoughts on marriage is that marriage, one, is a business. That's the main thing. It's a contractual relationship between you, your spouse, and the state. There's no way around that because the power of interpretation of contracts always is going to fall on the states, and in some cases, even the federal government. But when it comes to marriage, that's usually policed at the state level. So when you enter marriage, no matter what kind of contract it is, if it's a contract, it's under the jurisdiction of your state governments. There's no way around that. And the second thing I would say about marriage is that it's really about the unification of bloodlines. And that's critical. That's critical right there. The unification of bloodlines piece. Because I think we leave that out, even in conversations that I see happening on television at the mainstream level, in the movies that I watch and things like that. You don't really see people talking about the fact that, when you get married, that's the difference between cohabitation, casual dating, and casual fucking. You're uniting your genetic bloodline with another woman's genetic bloodline, but also the social, impact on who her parents are, who her brothers and sisters are, who her family is. So it's the unifying of families that happens as well. And that's why knowing that marriage is a business, you have to treat it just like that. So the same way that you wouldn't jump into a business endeavor without doing all your market research, the same way that you wouldn't jump into business without having like a certain amount of cash liquidity and wouldn't jump into it without having certain resources. That's my thought on marriage in the West. You just have to treat it like a business. And that makes it very difficult to get married in the West because it has to be treated like a business because it has so many business implications, but also emotional implications as well. No one talks about the impact on people when they get zeroed out in divorce, going through divorce, being torn from your children. I really believe that men have more of it impacts men on a psychological level. I would be probably more than the women from what we've learned over the last 40 years, because if you're a man that actually has discretion and you take your time and jumping into something, you're going to feel a certain way when that whole thing burns up, right? So if your relationship burns up, and so we'll get a little bit into like the data, the real raw data from the CDC and from the Department of Health and Human Services and from the state governments on where we are in marriage. So marriage is definitely on the decline, but we'll talk more about why those reasons are and what the pros and cons of marriage are and how we can fix it if it can be fixed in the West. So I'm going to bring up an article. This is from the Daily Caller based on the CDC's report, and I'll get into the CDC report later. So let me bring that up for everybody. So we're looking at the Daily Caller's website, and they were talking about the marriage issue recently. And this is an article just from April 29th, 2020. So this article was put out right at the peak of the COVID pandemic. And there's a specific reason why they put it out. And it's dealing with a lot of states are seeing an uptick in domestic violence cases between marriage couples. The courts are seeing a high demand for divorces that they've never seen, because you force people that have been married or in relationships to be in closed quarters with limited opportunities to socialize outside of their family household or whoever they're living with at that time. So it's creating a lot of domestic violence in American households right now. So we'll get into the article. It says, U.S. marriage rates drops to lowest level on record in over 150 years. Yes, that's a fact. U.S. marriage rates have dropped to the lowest level on record in over 150 years. And the citation for that is the CDC's marriage divorce rates 2018, 2019. Those were the most recent ones. So the article says that the U.S. marriage rate has dropped to the lowest on record since the federal government began keeping data in 1867, the Wall Street Journal reported Wednesday. The marriage rate fell 6% in 2018, with 6.5 unions formed for every 1,000 people. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, they're saying that the report reflects how economic insecurity and changing norms are eroding marriage. Now, that's critical because this is the CDC and the National Center for Health Statistics and the Wall Street Journal, right, in the study that they just did recently. And we know about economic insecurity because, again, it's a business. And with any business, you need resources, you need knowledge. So you need knowledge and you need resources before you jump into a business. So we know that part. But the part that I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable with and are ignoring is the changing norms in society, the normalization of bachelorhood and bachelorettehood, the normalization of single motherhood, and then you have the same-sex marriage. And you also have the normalization of polyamory, and you have a growing contingent of Americans that are actually pushing for polygamy, because just out in Utah, they just changed their laws on polygamy now. So you can actually have multiple wives out in Utah now. And I even saw a city in a city in Delaware, somewhere on the East Coast, where they were legalizing prostitution and they were legalizing polygamy as well. So these norms in America are definitely changing, and it's really hit like warp speed since the year 2000 when I look at the information. So it says that the report reflects how this economic insecurity and changing norms are eroding marriage, which has plunged since the Great Depression in the 1930s, according to the Wall Street Journal. So we're talking about a 90-year slow decline that's really, going fast forward in the last 20 years. And it says millennials are in peak marriage years, their 20s and their 30s. So that's why it's important that we learn what men in their 20s and 30s think about the marriage market, what they think about the feminine product produced in America. This is historic. It's saying that this is historic and it's still dropping. This is from Sally Curtain, a statistician at the Center for National Health Statistics. The marriage rate rebounded sharply after World War II, when marriages hit a high of 16.4 marriages per 1,000 people in 1946. But beginning in 1982, the rate declined until 2009. So it's 1982 is really when it just, boom, it declined. But there was like recessionary reasons for that as well. And then you had a lot of factories starting to leave America in the 80s. So these things contributed as well. So it flattened before inching upward in 2014. So it started to flatten in 2009. Then it started back up again around 2014, and that's where we're at today. So since 2014, it started up again. And we'll get into some of that. And you guys can tell me why you think that is. And if some of the, if Edward shows up, we can get his opinion on it. So it says declining religious observation and growing acceptance of cohabitation have also contributed to the marriage decline, according to the Wall Street Journal. Many couples are opting for cohabitation instead of marriage. According to the statistics from 2018 report, 17.1% of women and about 16% of men aged 18 to 44 were cohabitating. So actually, there's more women that are cohabitating than men. So that means that they're adding in the same sex element. So think about that. There's actually more women cohabitating than there are men. So that means that women with the same sex things, they're seeing that same sex female couples are moving in with each other in a cohabitated state more so than other groups. The marriage decline has come for middle earners and those with only a high school education. And the coronavirus pandemic may further discourage marriage due to financial security. However, the pandemic could also result in a burst in marriages once restrictions are lifted and the economy rebounds. So that's the Daily Caller's take on that. I'll just look at the chat and see. So what do you all think about that article? What they're saying in there? Anything surprise you so far? Hey, shout out to the brother AJ, man. AJ, if you want to come up in like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, let me know, bro. You know my email, because it's kind of going to be an open panel I just want to be on here for like an hour or two just to get brothers' takes on it, especially those that are married and especially those that are between 25 and 40 years old, because ultimately that's the peak marriage age right now. And those are the millennial people. So if you're in a situation where you're married and you've been married, I definitely would like your take on this as well, what we're going to talk about tonight. So let me see what you guys are saying. So let me see. So OG Bobby Johnson, he says, the answer is simple: no fault divorce. What man want to give half his stuff to a woman who can leave at any time? Oh yeah, we're definitely gonna get into the no fault divorce, because some of the stuff I read about that is very interesting, because so much of that stuff is before our time, man. And why they did it, who did it, they set in place basically the destruction of the private family, and that's what's been going on. And this didn't happen over the last 20 years, 50 years. It's really been a 100-year process to destroy the private family. And there's reasons for that in regards to, family is where you gain your first ideas about loyalty. And that plays a big role in why there's been such a push by certain elites and especially like the academic institutions in Hollywood to push private marriage out of the picture. Because if the more loyal you can make children to the state and to corporate brands and things like that, and the stronger those bonds are, it's going to be less bonds between the family. So we all become products of kind of like the corporate state, the police state. That's just kind of where we're going. But this is not something that started in the last 20 years. And we're going to get into some of the real history that too many people tend to ignore. So let me see. Ayanda says, so Brother Turbattle says the marriage contract is a dicey proposition. Yeah. It's a very dicey proposition, because it even though marriage is a business, it doesn't quite operate the way that a business contract does in the real world. It operates differently because of the human element. It operates so differently in terms of what you can get when you leave, what is owed, and things like that. And there's a lot of bias in it when it comes to like family law versus, obviously contract law. So there's a lot of biases built in. And we know that most women end up getting the children. And because of our chivalrous history, it will tend to be that the male is the higher income earner. So he's the ones that got with the bill. So we're going to talk more about it. But my whole thing with marriage also is that I think marriage is a class thing. I think a brother definitely should not marry outside of your class. You're kind of setting yourself up unless you're marrying up, which they call hypogamy, not hypergamy, but hypogamy or hypogamy. When men do it, it's called hypogamy, I believe. And more men are doing that because more and more women are making more money than men. That's why I thought that we had a great breakthrough in terms of this whole argument about the gender pay gap, because you notice that conversation has kind of been muted the last 2 years, and it all really started with the Silicon Valley. For those that don't know, Silicon Valley, because of the growth in female politics over the last 5 years or so, they started doing like internal audits of what they were paying men versus what they were paying women. And what a lot of these Silicon Valley companies found out is that they were so intent on being politically correct, they found out that they had actually been paying the women more than the men. But there was no outcry from society when it happened. They took that out of the mainstream media quickly. But they actually found out that they were paying women more. And also, women tend to congregate in like government jobs as well. And those tend to be the more secure jobs. And they also tend to pay more than what the private market would pay for the same kind of skills and job duties as well. So these things are important. This idea that women are broke out here, I've never seen it in my real life. Every woman I've been with and the woman I'm dating right now, they all got money. So I guess it just depends on what dating pool you're in. But women out here is not as broke as people are saying. And if you're definitely dating like outside of the non-ADOS community, it's definitely not an issue. As Google learned itself, they were paying women more. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the statistics. So we all know now that the marriage rates are the lowest they've been in 150 years. That's a fact. The average age that a man gets married in America is 30. So we're at the peak years right now. Our men between the ages of like 28 and 38 range. Because usually if you make it to 40 and you've never been married before, you're probably not going to actually get married for most people. So for most men in America, if they make it to 40 without ever having been married, their likelihood of getting married drops drastically. And that's why they tend to look at the ages of like 25 to 38. Now, we also have to talk about the average length of marriage, because that's a critical piece as well. So what is the average length of marriage in America? The average length of American marriages. Now, there's two categories you have to look at first. First, you have to look at when you take all the 7 living generations together. So right now, the oldest married person and the youngest married person, that would put it at probably 16 to maybe 100, because there are some couples that make it to 100 together. So let's say the oldest couple is 100 years old, and the youngest in some states you can get married at 16 with your parents' approval. So what they do, they average it all together. So in America, that number is 8 years. 8 years. Now, when you filter out the oldest 3 generations, the baby boomers, the silent generation, and the greatest generation, and you're looking strictly at Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, because maybe there's some Gen Zs that are getting married now. Now you're talking only like 3 or 4 years. That's critical. The average marriage for those that are under 50 years old in America now, because of those changing norms that they talk about, especially with the role of cohabitation. Even my own grandmother used to say it. She used to say this all the time. Black women used to know this. They used to say, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? I know all of you in the chat have heard that before. And this is that cohabitation factor right there. So many men can get what they want, and so many women can get what they want from each other without being married. So that's another reason they don't get married, because that's just like, okay, let's go sign this contract or not. They're like, I don't want to sign the contract. I'm getting the sex that I want. I'm getting the attention I want. And when I'm not getting, I can leave without having the state involved in it. You see what I'm saying? Without having the family entanglements and all of that. So that's one of the reasons that has played a big role too. So that's a fact. And so when you talk about how long does it take the average person to be in a relationship before actually getting married, that's another critical factor. That's 5 years. In America, the average pre-relationship before marriage is an average of 5 years. Whereas the general relationships in America are average of 3 months. So now we're starting to see the true facts about the situation. most relationships in America, now we got to remember we're talking about before this COVID, because COVID has changed everything. But before March 2020, we were at an average of 3 months for relationships. So people, they get into a relationship, it's hot and heavy, the first month or two. And then they start, once that third month hits, and they start to see, oh, we're not even compatible. They're out of there. That's where we're at now. But for those that do end up on that marriage track, their average cohabitation relationship is 5 years. Whether they're cohabitating or they're just dating and they're living separately. But most married people in America, on the date that they get married, they were together for on average 5 years. So now you see what we're up against when we're talking about under 40, because with the younger people today, when you're talking about the youngest Gen Xers, the millennials, and the Gen Zs, they're just not doing good in relationships that go beyond 3 months right now. So that's that information. So when I was listening to Edward Anderson, he was talking about one of the reasons to get married that he's heard. One of the arguments that he's heard is that, well, corporate CEOs get married. That's one of those conversation pieces that doesn't even make any sense in the context of black men for the most part, because black men aren't getting jobs in corporate America like that for the last 20 years. They've been passed over because, again, we have to remember, as I just said with the Google situation, gender affirmative action since the 90s has been the trend with government policy and protecting those in the workforce. They have been promoting women heavily for the last 30 years. And that's their preference for college. Now at all the universities, women have surpassed men in college now. And now they're starting to surpass them at the grad school level as well, especially like the social sciences, right? Like law. Women now make up the majority of law students. So guess what that means? If things continue at the rate that they are, women are going to control the legal structures of most states. They'll be the majority policymakers in the next decade. But again, COVID has changed everything. So I'm really talking about things up until March 2020. So when you talk about the corporate thing, it's one of those conversations that doesn't really make sense to me. If that's why you want to sell marriage, because first off, most black men aren't going to get hired in corporate America. Most black men aren't going to last in corporate America. And very few black men are going to become a CEO of a corporation. Now, how do I know this? I know you all are going to be shocked when I tell you this. You're going to be shocked. There are only 4 black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in 2020 before the COVID. After COVID, there'll probably be none, because at the rate of bankruptcies for 2020, it's already surpassed any point in the last 50 years of corporate bankruptcies. You even have companies now moving to a Zoom model, what we're doing right now. They're doing all their business online now. Many companies, even some government agencies, they're doing everything online for the most part. And that's going to clean up a lot of extra positions that were there that weren't needed and that were just extra expenses. And a lot of retail, commercial square footage that these organizations use is going to shrink as well over the next couple of years, just because of what happened with COVID. So again, the highest amount of corporate bankruptcies we've ever seen before. And again, black men weren't becoming CEOs. Did you guys see what I said? Out of the Fortune 500 companies, after all the sacrifices that our grandfathers made, our fathers made in their generation, there are only 4 black CEOs in corporate America. That's 0.008%, less than 1%, okay? And we're not in a stage right now where they're pumping more dollars into black men getting into these jobs. It's going to shrink. Even if you took the COVID off the table, just the way that public policy was working, the affirmative action was going to new immigrants to America, both legal and illegal, and women. That's where it was already going for the last 2 decades. And COVID is just going to speed up everything, because for all that people say about, all the kumbaya, when people are in a survival mode, they tend to hit back against this idea of saving everybody. They get into the survival mode is that I'm going to protect myself first, then I'm going to protect my family, and then my friends that are like me. And that's the mode that we're about to go in with this COVID. And I know because, again, here we are on Friday, the 24th of July, 2020. And the whole stimulus thing, they just crashed and burned on those negotiations. Everyone thought that they were going to get that fourth stimulus out by today. They thought they were going to get it done this week. Now, right now, the Trump and the GOP leadership in the Senate, they don't agree on certain things right now. That's just within their own caucuses. Then you have to bring that whatever they agree to, which probably won't even be for another week if it passes, even another week. They still got to meet with the Democrats, who have a totally different vision of what their stimulus will look like, because they put a bill out there called the HEROES Act. And that's a $3.3 trillion stimulus bill. And Trump and the Republicans said dead on arrival, because that's been out there for 2 months now. And they said dead on arrival. Ain't going to be no $3.3 trillion stimulus coming out of Congress, they said. So what they've been waiting for is to see what offerings would the GOP put forward in Trump. So what we found out, they're saying no more than $1 trillion. They want something that's less than $1 trillion. So that's $2 trillion less than what the HEROES Act under the Democrats would have been. So we know now it's going to be $1 trillion. So it's going to, someone has to lose in that situation. And from what I'm hearing, they're really against extending the unemployment. And that's a critical piece as well, because there was 2 elements to the unemployment. You have to understand, most states, you're on unemployment for a max of 3 to 6 months. If you're in like one of the wealthier states, you might get it for 6 months max. And then, you know, the range is usually, I think the lowest unemployment check you can get, I believe, is like in Mississippi or Alabama, and it's probably like $185 or something like that. And I think the highest you can get is probably in New York, and I think theirs might be 1,000. So that's the range for what people get. So what happens is that you want 2 things. You want to be able to extend the amount of time people can get that, but then there's also the bonus that they were giving to unemployed people over the last 2 months. And so what was happening is that, so let's say you're that person that's living in Mississippi and you only qualify for $185 a week. Under the bonus that the government passed, and this was a bipartisanship thing under the CARES Act, you were getting an extra $600. So now your income was $785. That's a godsend to a person that's at the lowest end. Now, if you're more in like the middle states who pay something like, let's say your state is, I think my state's is 700 is the highest you can get. Now that person's income just jumped to $1,300, right? Now, if you're living in the coastal states, it's not going to have the same impact, because if you're in California and let's say you can get 1,000, that bonus is 600, right? But you're still getting 1,600. For most people, they can stay above water with $1,600 each week, because they're pulling in probably like 5 G's. So what is that? That would be equivalent to like 60K. So the Republicans have already said that's not going to happen. So they're like that extra bonus, either it's going to get wiped out completely next week, or it's going to be modified to somewhere between 50% to 100% of what your weekly earnings would be. So let's say a clean number like 200. The Republicans would say, well, we'll keep it at $100 to $200. So that person would get either between $250 or they would get $400. That's one of the more moderate Republican proposals that I've heard. But again, McConnell, he doesn't want it. He's the leader. Trump has been kind of like neutral on it. He even wants to give a big stimulus. Trump was saying that he wants to send people a bigger stimulus check, a direct cash payment than they did last time. But they want to modify it. So like, I think the range before was that everyone under, I believe, $150,000 got something. But if you got made under $75,000, you got the full amount of $1,200 or something like that. They're saying that they want to restrict it to 40,000 and under. So again, this is just the Republicans in their own caucuses before they meet with the Democrats next week. So they're saying they want to restrict it to those making less than 40,000 because they said that they've been the most impacted by COVID. So this is the economy situation that we're in, man. So, and that's going to have a heavy impact on family development, family planning, and what the mating market is going to look like going forward. So when we talk about this whole corporate thing, we got to really get down to these details. And that's why I'm giving you guys information, because when you look at like the average age of a CEO, The average age of a CEO is 53 years old, and their average tenure is 8 years. So they usually end up retiring around 61 or 62 years old, most CEOs. So they're basically their tenure is age 53 to about 62. That's what we're getting. And again, just remember what I said. So people are talking about things that they don't even actually put out the real information. That there's only 4 Black CEOs of the top Fortune 500 companies. That's less than 1%, 0.008%. Your chances of getting that's management, not just CEOs. That statistic of less than 1% includes all upper management and executive positions in corporate America. So it'd even be one thing if we were just talking about the CEOs, right? But we're talking about the entire C-suite. We're talking about chief marketing officer, the CEO, chief operating officers. We're talking about all the upper tier management. It's still less than 1%, even though Black Americans are somewhere between 10 and 13%. See what I'm saying? So there's no correlation at all, because we know based on Black demographics that, well, this was as of 2010, but the best data we have until the next census is that 33% of Black men were married. As between 2010 and today, it's around 33%. So based on even that, if there's a direct correlation between marriage and success in corporate America, there shouldn't only be less than 1% of Black men that are in the executive and other high manager positions in corporate America, but that's reality. So that's a fact that you can take to the bank right there. So we know the average CEO is 53 years old and does 8 years before they retire. And they damn sure ain't mostly Black. 4 Black CEOs, and we don't even know if they'll be there 6 months from now. Don't be shocked if I come back to you in 6 months and say there are no Black CEOs come January 2021. Because I'm looking at these corporate bankruptcies and it's ugly, man. It is ugly right now. And another thing about the marriage thing, so when I hear a lot of the older Black men talk about it, they forget that young people learn from watching, okay? Young people learn from watching. And unfortunately, many of us have grown up not seeing good examples of marriage. No one talks about this. What has been the example that people have set for marriage in the last 40 years? What has been the example? That's why I started this clip off with Will Smith and Jada Pinkett. Perfect example. Even when caught in infidelity, and even when just the opportunity to save face, that was shocking to me. No matter what the status of their relationship is, the humiliation of your husband for national consumption does not make one say, damn, I really want to go get married tomorrow. Even after being caught in an affair, lying about what it was, had to be forced out on national TV. And then when given the chance to give the authority and power back to her husband, guess what she says? Can no man, even her husband, even her male concubine, can tell her yes or no to sex. She's saying that I have a husband, or what I call a CUXband, based on the definition of cuck, which, because I was always interested in that word cuck, and they the way that the dictionary defines a cuck is a husband of an adulterous wife. That's the basic definition of a cuck. But there's also an evolutionary biology definition as well that I'll give you guys that says the term is also applied to males who are unwittingly investing parental effort in offspring that are not of their own genetic making. Now, we're all familiar with that in America, where we got Maury Povich show to thank for that. Finding out that a lot of you dudes have been raising children that was not yours the whole time, since up until the DNA test became popular. So we all know about the cuckold. So there's the knowing cuckold and the unknowing. And the situation that happened with Will and Jada is that it was knowing, and then it was just all lies. They tried to say that he knew about it. He said, no, I didn't know about it, and I didn't approve of it. He said he didn't approve anything, but they're lying on him to his face. You did approve of it. And then even after being confronted, she had no accountability for it. And so what is the example that she's setting for millions of women? What is the example that Will Smith is setting for millions of men? That if you're going to be married, that this is the standard that you have to accept, because that's almost like the implicit interpretation that you get is that they're saying that you have to accept being a cuckold in modern America. That's almost like the implicit interpretation I have of seeing it, man. That they're trying to say that if marriage is going to exist going forward, it's going to exist with the woman leading the relationship, and now reversing the roles of the men and women, and you better accept it. And if you don't accept it, you're a misogynist pig. So the brother Ed Ben 24, appreciate you, says, could you name the CEOs and companies they led? Man, I know that one of them was a pharmaceutical company. Shit. Yeah, I don't have the exact information with each company, but I know that one of the brothers' name that's more popular of the CEOs is named Kenneth Frazier, Ed Ben. So you could look him up. I know one of them is named Renee Jones. Okay, I remember him, Renee Jones, and he looks like he could pass for white. This guy is one of these black guys that is so Caucasian looking that you wouldn't even know that he was black. Because when I was doing the research on him, he's the CEO of M&T Bank. And his name is Renee Jones. I remember. So it was Kenneth Frazier, Renee Jones, and I forget the other two, bro. Because, like, you know, when you're doing that kind of research, man, you can only take cliff notes at the time. So I would have to actually, you know, go back up my computer. But the major point for me was that it's only 4 as of today. So you can pretty much look at that. So I know M&T Bank is one. Kenneth Frazier is at one of these pharmaceutical companies. I don't know if it was, I think it might be Merck. I think the company that Kenneth Frazier is at Merck, but don't quote me on that one. So you can just do a look for that one. But yeah, so the trend in corporate America has been to not employ black men. And I don't know how that's getting left out of these discussions. I was hoping that Edward could make it, but I know he said that he may not be able to, because I wanted to, you know, kind of continue that conversation with him. But yeah, the corporate American piece it's fallacious. It's mostly a fallacious argument. And then when you also look at the other element, what does corporate America even mean going forward? And what has it already been trending towards over the last 10 years? The corporate model for doing business is actually being replaced by gazelle startups, man, and less employees, more output, more production, and more efficiency. And that's always been the corporate model for the most part. What is most efficient? And this whole COVID pandemic has allowed for companies to do things that they wouldn't have been able to politically do even just 6 months ago. If you think about it, now they can get, I know you guys heard about Macy's bankruptcy. All these retailers are going bankrupt now, man. All of the retailers are going bankrupt. And now some of the, now Delta Airlines just announced that they're about to be laying off a whole bunch of people. So it seems like when COVID first hit during what would have been the Q2, so in Q2, it was all about the retailers going bankrupt. So the retailers already wanted to switch to like a more of an online e-commerce store model. They already wanted to do that. And Macy's got rid of all its employees for the most part because they're going to the online drop shipping model. They shed like 150,000 employees, man, from the moment that Donald Trump announced the national emergency. Companies like Macy's, dude, they were shedding like 150,000 people in like a week and closing up all their stores never to return. So that's where we're at right now. Do you guys realize that there are 50 million people getting unemployment right now and another 50 million that don't even qualify? So we're talking 100 million people that are in some state of unemployment that want to be employed or that are employable. That's a reality as we have this conversation right now. So we don't even know what the corporate model is going to look like. But if I was to make my prediction, I would say that the corporate model is going to look something like what Amazon's doing for most companies. Because that's one of the things that we kind of learned from this essential and non-essential worker discussion now. No one was talking about who was essential and who was not essential 6 months ago. Everything looked great. The economy was banging for most people. But now it's a question of who has essential skills, who doesn't have essential skills. Now it's hitting the universities, which is very interesting. I'm reading reports now of all kinds of professors at universities and teachers being fired right now. And the only ones kind of having some protection are those that are like the more senior tenure. So now it's starting to hit academia too right now, while we sit here waiting to see, do they do a stimulus? So this new normal that we're in, it's going to be a very trimmed down survival of the fittest mode for some time. I don't know how long. You know, that's the question. I do not know, man. And uncertainty is one of those things that is, when you have such uncertainty, it's hard to plan for anything. Most people are just happy to be healthy right now. Shout out to the brother Fast Attack. What up to you too, man? Appreciate you. Thanks for dropping in. So you're going to have a lot of people working from home now. They're going to be doing their meetings on Zoom. And it just depends on how good it goes. So I know that in Silicon Valley, they've already said it's permanent now. I know that Twitter, Google, they're doing a full-time permanent employees at home. And so we'll have to see over a year or two what that looks like fully in terms of how many they keep and how many they find out saying that, okay, well, now we can let some of y'all go. So we don't know. Shout out to Don Gordito. Hey, Don, I sent you the link if you want to come up, because I know you're a brother that went through a pretty serious divorce. You were telling me before. So definitely, if you want to come up, let me know. So another thing I was thinking about with this marriage conversation, now that we got the corporate thing out of there, because again, the corporate thing doesn't even make any sense, because black men aren't being hired in corporate America. The lowest amount of black men working in corporate America is right now in 2020. Older black men didn't build any corporations for where they could be like, okay, we're going to bring in all these young black men to work for us. They didn't do that. It didn't happen. Where are all these black corporations that are run by black men that can hire younger black men to come into the corporation with their black wife and move up the ladder, which, you know, getting into the higher managerial offices in corporate America is like a 20-year process, man. And that's one of the reasons why things are so in a flux right now, because if up until recently, to become like a CEO, it was like a 20-year track to get in that, even in the managerial ranges. It took about 15 to 20 years, depending on how talented you were and depending on the nature of the industry. But most people don't even stay with their corporation that very long anymore. People are constantly moving around. A lot of corporations have moved to more of a contractor 1099 model. So it's becoming harder and harder to move up in corporations just because of how quickly they're moving people in and out of their corporations now. And now, again, it's going to be very trimmed down moving forward. So for me, I've just always been realistic about marriage. My mother's been married multiple times. My father passed away when I was very young, but all his brothers have been married multiple times. So when you look at just that whole history, it's been a history of non-stability over the last 30 years in a lot of families in America. And what marriage means today in 2020, it didn't mean in 1970. And this didn't happen by accident. And that's where we kind of got to get into like how we got to the no-fault divorce thing, man. But I basically call it the holy trinity of the defense of marriage. And what I'm referring to is the fact that there were basically like 3 or 4 main pillars of protecting marriage and having a strong foundation for society. And that was coverture. Coverture was the laws that had what they called fault divorce. So until 1969, 1970, the whole country was under a fault divorce standard. And with the fault divorce standard, it was very, very difficult to get a divorce up until 1970, unless there was a case of clear adultery, extreme cruelty on the part of one of the spouses, or desertion, abandonment, more than 2 years. Because even with the abandonment, they didn't even let you get divorced up until 1970 in most states, unless the person that you were separated from had been gone for 2 years. So let's say you had like a husband or a wife, they come home, their spouse is gone, they put in like a missing report, this person to call. Even though this person might be missing and gone and didn't tell you anything and just ghosted you, most states still wouldn't let you get divorced until that person had been gone 2 years. And that changed in 1969, 1970, which is a very critical year. So with the coverture, those were all these laws like fault divorce that protected the sanctity of marriage. But then you also had the idea, the church. So the church was that second strong pillar that gave us, for the majority of Americans, it gave them their moral center of what they're supposed to be as a husband and a wife. What have we seen in the last 40 years? The depowering and of these churches is getting to the point where the younger people don't want anything to do with church at all. So they want to get rid. They feel like the church is hypocritical, and there's a lot of reason to feel that way. Now, when you talk about the women, a lot of women are really against the church because of the kind of code that it puts on women and the kind of responsibilities for behavior that it puts on women. So there's a strong move against religion among those in the younger Gen Xers, millennials, and under. Strong rejection of religion. So that was the second pillar. So coverture was destroyed with the in the 70s. I think the last state to have coverture, and if you guys know what coverture is, basically your wife was under your authority and the state enforced it. You were her guardian. And this was enforced all the way up to some point in the 60s. But then again, you know, the sexual revolution and all that came in the late 60s and the 70s. And by that time, all those laws were rejected by the courts. But people forget it wasn't that long ago, you know, that things like miscegenation and things like coverture were taken off the books. We're talking in our parents, some of our parents were born around that time, boomers. Our boomer parents were born at that time. So it was the boomers who became socialized into this new environment, right? So with the birth control, with the no-fault divorce, with the abolishing coverture, the boomers came of age as the first generation to live and to see it in full effect, right? So it was their parents' generation, which is called the silent generation, that passed all these laws. So it was the silent generation and the greatest generation that controlled the legislatures. Now, when we talk about the no-fault thing, we're talking about Ronald Reagan. Most people have no clue that it was California was the first state to pass no fault. So again, let's go back to the fault divorce. Fault divorce was adultery, extreme cruelty, abandonment, desertion, minimum of 2 years. That was the standard up until California became the first state to pass no fault. And that was a Republican decision. During the 1969 to 1971 session of the California legislature, Ronald Reagan was the governor. He was the 33rd governor of California. And then it was a state legislature that was run by Republicans in the Senate and the House. They had a supermajority in both, which is something that a lot of people hearing this is kind of surprised because, again, you know, California has been mostly a Democratic state for the last, 70 years. There's only been 2 situations in California where the Republicans had a majority, and that was in that session of 1969 to 1971, and then 1994 to 1996. So only 2 times have the Republicans, you know, been the majority while having a sitting governor. So it was Ronald Reagan who signed that bill, and he signed that bill. He signed it in September 4th, 1969. And it took effect on January 1st, 1970. So that's when it all started. So at that point, I think that the youngest boomers would have been in kindergarten at that point, and the oldest boomers at that time would have been just about graduating from high school at that time. So that's kind of, you know, this is the history of how we got here. But it didn't happen overnight, even with Reagan signing it. People forget. When you look at the different waves of feminism, and you go from the first to fourth wave, the first wave was the longest part of this feminist trend that we've seen growing over the last 100 years. People forget that because of the lack of technology and ability to, lobby in the way that we can today, it took the first wave feminists a long time to make their gains, right? That's why they consider the first wave to go all the way from the 1830s to the 1950s. That's a hell of a long time, 120 years. So the first wave of feminism technically was about 120 years, right? And then the second wave was 1960 to about 1990. That was 30 years. And now the third wave, 1990 to 2012. And the fourth wave is 2013 to present, which is, you know, it's really defined by like the Me Too movement, the futurist female, the moment that we're in now, digital warfare. But we got to think about that. It took 120 years of lobbying and organizing just to get through the first wave. Now it's speeding up so quickly. And the goal was female independence and freedom. Not all feminists are against marriage, but most are. And the most extreme hate the idea of marriage. So 120 years to get that first law passed. Because remember, Reagan was lobbied by an organization called the National Association of Women's Lawyers group. You probably never even heard of that group before. This group is a very old group. So these were rich white women who, even during the early 1900s, were still getting educations. And we seem to think that these women were just indentured servants to their husbands, but that's not true. There was a hell of a lot of women in the 1900s that had education, that had great high-paying jobs even then. So there's a lot of misleading going on. But that's why we have these conversations, to get down to the actual facts of things and not feelings. So no-fault divorce was the primary agenda of this group. For all you guys, again, the National Association of Women Lawyers, who undertook what they considered to be the greatest project. And guess what the greatest project was? Getting rid of fault divorce. So that group started around 1911, but it took them like 40 years of lobbying to actually even get that policy even on the books of the male legal organizations, because they were separate organizations for the men and the women. So it took them 40 years just to get the male lawyer association to even acknowledge that they had a problem with the way that the fault divorce was. And they finally started listening to these women around the 50s and the 60s. And then what happened, by the time 1969 came around, these women had convinced enough of the white men in the legal fields that this fault divorce standard is biased towards women. So that was their argument. And so now it was the women and the men in the legal field that combined, and they used their resources and influence to influence someone like Ronald Reagan. And they said, hey, we need to get you to pass this law. And so the actual first no-fault law was called the No-Fault Family Law Act of 1969. And that's what Ronald Reagan signed on September 4th, 1969. And from there, it was quickly, replicated by the other states. Now, think about what I just said, man. These were women way back in the first couple of decades of the 20th century who were saying that we was already tired of this fault standard. They wanted their freedom even back then, but there weren't enough men that were buying into their arguments until they got to the 60s and the 70s. And they called it the greatest undertaking for women of that time after getting the right to vote, right? So after they got the right to vote, they said, now that we got the right to vote, and this is how you get that lobbying thing started happening. So now they got the right to vote. It took a long time, but they started to get into the lobbying thing. And the next thing they wanted to do is change the standard of marriage, because they felt that that standard restricted their ability to move freely and to leave whenever they wanted to. And it is what it is, because I'm a free market person. I'm with it. People should have the right to leave whenever they want to. But again, everything has a cost and a benefit to it. And the cost that we've seen of people being able to just get into a marriage and leave it whenever they want to is that instability in society, instability in the household, and really the most damage is to the children. So it's just a very chaotic time that we're in, man. And it's just reality. So they called that their biggest project, was to get that fault divorce turned over. So they spent 50 years lobbying, putting their money together and putting pressure on the male lawyers, because again, you got to remember to change. So that pre-World War II standard was still traditional. Woman, shut up, go wash the dishes. But then we had the sexual revolution, the cultural revolution of the 60s and the civil rights movement and all that. Now these women, they really used it as like a ladder to power. So it really started back then. So now that we know that, like in corporate America, the preference now is for women and non-ADOS black men. They don't really want black men in corporate America. That's just where things are, man. You can kind of see it with Hollywood right now. Everything that comes out now is like the first woman to do this or the first woman to do that. Every movie is a woman. All these male characters are being turned into female characters now, We've all seen it. So that's another trend that's going on now. Taking all the male heroes, the Flash, Iron Man, they're all being turned into females now. So that tells you, because the same thing happened in the 60s and 70s. You started seeing black men in television. You started seeing black men doing like interracial things. There was a moment, it was a small moment before the backlash of the 80s, of course, but there was a moment between like 65 and about 77 where black men became the face of the moment, right? That's why you had a bunch of black mayors. There, in America, there had only been like one black mayor for like 100 years prior to 1965. But what happened over the next 10 years is that with so much attention on the United States and the racial terrorism and whatnot, they had to put tokens in place. And that's when we got all these black men that became mayors of urban cities in the 70s. So there was a time when black men were the face. And then also there was another part of that. Just like you're seeing this push to put black women, Asian women, and all these other women in these positions in corporate America, there was a moment when that happened with black men where they were the ones that were the preferred minority to be admitted to universities, to be admitted to managerial programs at corporations. Matter of fact, one of my favorite stories is about Stanley O'Neill and how he used the affirmative action program of the 60s and 70s to get himself into the University of Michigan. He was just a worker on the assembly line up there in Michigan, I believe it was. And what happened is that when the whole civil rights thing came in, these companies, to improve their image, they were looking for any black man who had the potential to go to a university on a scholarship from these corporations and then come back and work at a corporation. So that's kind of how it started. But what happened is that in the 80s, there was a backlash against that. That's how you got like the reverse racism arguments coming before the courts. And then they slowly got black men out of the preference status. And then they kind of started switching to the women because the white men figured, well, if I'm going to have affirmative action, I'd rather be working with these white women than these black men. It's unfortunate, but that's what happened. So slowly but surely, as we get to the 90s, it's like it just started to take off. And now it's just beyond obvious now that if it comes down to a job between you as a black man and a woman with the same credentials, I'd bet you for like office jobs, they will take the woman over you. They're going to start restricting men more and more to like things that women don't want to do. Mark my words. They're going to start restricting men to more and more jobs that women can't do or won't do. So there was something else that I wanted to say before so yeah, that information, hopefully you guys, that's helpful for you to learn about the National Association of the Women, because they were the ones that put this all in motion. And so with that act that they passed in California, it abolished the fault grounds of divorce, replacing it with no fault. Under the fault standard before 1970s, those couples, it was just hard to get divorced. And now we're in this climate now where the question becomes, what do we want out of marriage? That becomes the question now. What do you actually want out of marriage? And what do you get out of marriage that you don't get out of cohabitation? Now, I've been in what most people call like common law marriages in some states, because I like long-term relationships. And the reason I like long-term relationships because I feel like it's a better environment for sex, personally. Some brothers, they like, they like the one-night stands things. I never really was big on it, and I've done it plenty, but I've always had the most enjoyment out of having a woman that I can, have a sexual relationship with on a consistent basis, because my vetting standard is kind of high. So once I find a woman that really fits it, I'm gonna keep her around as long as I can until we both get bored of each other or whatever. So for me, when I think of marriage, I think of a business. I think of the unifying of the bloodlines. Is this woman bringing a feminine product to the table? Does she meet my attractiveness standard? Does she have deference for men? Will she cooperate or submit? Is she loyal? And does she come from good breeding? See, the qualifications for a wife are serious, man, because you got to treat a wife just like you would a business. Whereas casual sex, as long as she meets like one or two of your criteria, most dudes is with it. They're gone. They're in the win. Hey, she looks good, I'm going. You know what I'm saying? She's attractive and she's feminine, I'm going. But with marriage, nah, it's a whole nother game. Because another thing too, man, with the marriage thing, you got to look at this woman and say, I would want my daughter to be like her. That's another thing. A lot of you brothers would bang plenty of women that you know that you would never want your daughter to be. Lots of men, we know that we will do that. We will bang women that we would never want our daughter to be. And that's another critical piece. When you look at this woman and you've learned her character and everything, and you've matched on a whole lot of other levels, that when you look at her and you say, based on what I know about how long a marriage would last, the odds are against me. It's stacked against me. If I break up with this woman, as it's most likely going to happen within 4 or 5 years, right when the kid is starting kindergarten, what is the relationship that I'm going to have with her and that child going forward? Because remember, we're the most mobile, potentially mobile generation in history. The most mobile potential generation in absolute history, man. So it used to be that a lot of couples, when they broke up, most of the time they just stayed in the same town. So you were able to see, your divorced father, your divorced mother, whatever. They were able to see each other pretty regularly. But now it's not the case anymore. People now want to move around, especially when something traumatic like that happens in their life. A lot of people want to restart over. So now you got to deal with the fact that, she might live in the Midwest. You might live on the West Coast or the East Coast. So now, at best, you're going to see your children during the summer. And that's only if she's very much willing to work with you. What happens when she's divorced? And I heard that argument too. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, so if we know that it takes like 20 years to rise in corporate America to the upper level management, that means that you might be before, even if you had that chance, you might be gotten married 3 times before you get to that corporate management level. And so one of the arguments that I heard Edward say that he's heard is that, well, if you show that you're married, it shows that you're a good manager of your household, right? And I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, I'll accept that argument. But then there's another side to the argument as well. And I'll see what you brothers in the chat think. So if the argument is that for public relation reasons, a marriage shows that you're good at managing a household, then what does divorce show? Using that business model of it being like a microcosm of your management skills, which I wouldn't even really argue with that. But then there has to be another side to it, because in corporate America, there's something called bankruptcies. There's something called bad management. So the other side of it would be that having multiple divorces shows that you're a bad manager of your household. It would be equivalent to a divorce, right? What do you guys think? If we take the argument that marriage represents ability to manage the household, what does divorce represent? Asking you in the chat, what does divorce represent to you then? Because to me, taking that argument, which I'll accept, that means that divorce means that you're a bad manager of your household. And if you have multiple divorces, you're a bad chooser of women, or she's a bad chooser of men. So then wouldn't that mean that you'd be a bad chooser of human resources in your company as well? So if the argument is that management of your household reflects your corporate skills, then it would also be mismanagement of your household represents your bad management skills. So divorce and multiple wives will be shunned and looked down upon. But me personally, I don't think that that's as important as it used to be, because again, we know that women are more single than men these days. Women are more single. And then you have the same sex people. They have the shortest term relationships, the most volatile relationships. So what are you going to do about that? Most of these women are single a lot of times in these corporate positions. And when you're talking about Black women, we know that they're the most single. And a lot of them they're making their way up the corporate ladder and they don't have a man. Oprah, and she's like, a lot of them look up to people like Oprah. So you're going to have more and more single women in corporate America. And we know that norms are created as its trend grows. So when if there's 10 people and only one's a bachelor or bachelorette, it looks one way. But what happens when there's 7 bachelors and bachelorette? Then the married people become the minority. And so as we have more and more women putting off marriage and putting off childbearing, as is the trend, you're going to have more and more women that are bachelorettes running corporate America. That's where we're at. So that's an interesting argument that I heard on this panel. That one didn't make any sense to me, because it's like, if we know that divorce rate, what it is, then and that tells you something about your business skills, well, there's going to be a lot of men out there that are going to find out they're not going to move in corporate America because they're going to be divorced almost assuredly by year 5 of their marriage. So you guys can take from that what you want. I don't know what you guys think about that, but that is another argument that I heard. And Edward was speaking against the argument, but I'm just using a different version because for me, I was thinking about the other side of it. That if it represents management, then divorce has to represent bad management. And so if we think about like what a corporation is made of, you know, marketing department, sales department, research and development, and human resources are usually the big 4 in a company: marketing, sales, human resources, and research and development. Now let's take that larger social model and then shrink it down to the microcosm. It would be the same thing with relationships. How you go about marketing yourself to attract the mate, right? Because that's what marketing is. Marketing is about a seller attracting a buyer, right? So if we shrink that down, dating is just another form of marketing where men are marketing themselves to be appealing to a woman and a woman is marketing herself to be appealing to a man. And you market yourself and then you got to close the sale, right? You got to close the sale if you guys are going to have a union. And then the human resources part is what happens when you have children, because you're adding a biological elements to your union. And that's what you do as a corporation as well. Corporations are adding a biological resource to their corporation for some kind of goal. And that goal is to have higher profits. And with children, now this is what the goal should be. The goal should be to pass on your genetic lineage and continue your family in the transfer of property. And that's where we get to the whole question of monogamy. Because communists are against monogamy. Radical feminists are mostly against monogamy. And many men are secretly against monogamy as well. They're just not as outspoken about it because they'll take a relationship, but a lot of them are against monogamy. It's just that right now, the communists, the Marxists, and the radical feminists are the most outspoken against monogamy because they consider it like a form of patriarchy, which they're actually right about that. Monogamy it was created in the capitalist model to be a form of patriarchal control over women's freedom to choose the men that they want outside of their marriage. Because you got to understand, back then they didn't have DNA testing as like, you know, you get to the Enlightenment era, the rise of industrial evolution, and you had like this explosion in regular men now having assets that they didn't used to have. Because you got to remember that under the old feudal system of Europe, it was a aristocracy kind of thing. But when the working class people and the what Marx calls the petty bourgeoisie overthrew the aristocrats and started to create these constitutional republics, and then this capitalism, regular men started to be able to make more money and get more land than they had ever gotten. Because remember, they were under the rule of the feudal lords. So they didn't have DNA testing. So they had to find out a way that now that I have this land, now that I have this money and property, and I'm dealing with this woman, and I need to ensure that these children are mine, that I'm going to be passing this property to. Because before, most men didn't have anything to pass on. So what happened is that the church became an institution and the coverture was added to protect the men from raising children that weren't theirs. But what's so fascinating is that they still failed at that. Because when we look at the numbers over the last 500 years for like men that have been cuckolded by their wives, it's pretty high. So even with those kind of controls that they tried to put on women, women found a way, bro, to get around and still make you think it was your child. So I guess it was like, they're like, damn, all these eyes are on me, but I got to make sure I pick a dude that kind of look like him and got the same eye color and hair color. He might be taller or shorter, but he'll just say, well, you know, I did have a tall great grandfather. So women found a way around that. But now all those safeguards are gone, man. And a lot of people are having a hard time accepting the new reality and the new normal, but it didn't happen in one generation, man. This thing, as I said, it really started really strongly with women in the 1830s up into the 1950s with that first wave. They planted the foundation of what was to come. And obviously people fear change. They do. But for younger men that are in that peak marriage range right now, they just kind of see it for what it is, because we were raised by second wave feminists. People forget that, man. People forget that. All these people complaining about the status of marriage now, where was y'all at for the last 40 or 50 years, man? No young people in their 20s or 30s asked to be in this situation. This is what we were born and socialized into. My mother was a second wave feminist, man. Third wave feminist. she never was cool with a man controlling her, man. And as soon as a man tried to control her too much, she's out. My mom to this day, and she's in her higher 50s right now. And her and I've had this conversation. And we've had this conversation, me and my own mother, man. And the women that were raised like in the 60s and 70s, dude, they were socialized not to be controlled by a man. But because there was less opportunities for women in the 60s and 70s, a lot of women, they dealt with it. But they really always wanted their freedom. And with the gender affirmative action really taking off in the 90s, that's when women said, nah, I'll leave you whenever I want to. Ain't going to be no man controlling me. And people forget, we were raised by mothers that came up in that second and third wave, man. And it's like everyone's talking about this whole marriage thing is like it just happened in 2020 that this problem. No, this has been a slow drip until we got to this point. And there weren't enough men speaking out against it that had influence and power back then. That's the problem. Hey, shout out to you brothers in the chat. James Smith, William Washington, Boundless, Art Nustel, D-Mac. Thanks for showing up, man. But so that's kind of like my thoughts on it. I just think that the whole thing is overblown, which is understandable because we're seeing the consequences of the 60s right now. We're all living through with the consequences of policies that at that time were new for the modern era, but they weren't new for the cycle of civilizations at all. We've been to even worse positions. Like I've read things on ancient Rome. At the point when ancient Rome's collapsed, their cities had turned into open brothels, dude. That's why when ancient Rome, which America is modeled after, when it actually collapsed, there was no morals, there was no religion anymore. The families have been destroyed. This happens with civilizations all the time. And most historians say that civilizations are on like 1,000-year cycle in 250-year sects, where it's almost predictable exactly the trends that will be in each block. They call it seasons, and the spring being the birth of a civilization and its reason to exist and its mission statement, and then moving into like summer when it peaks and all the beauty of that civilization and what it represents becomes known to the world. So in our situation with the West, that would be things like the scientific method, the promotion of philosophy, the Christian church, and those things. And then as it moves into like what they call, so we got the fall season, then you kind of start to see a decline in the innovation in terms of the artistic output. You know what I'm saying? The innovation, it becomes standard and it becomes sanitized in what they call the fall season. We're in what they call the winter season of a civilization, the last 250 years. And we're actually like in the last 50 years of that cycle. And you know this because you can go study any civilization. In that phase, you start to see androgyny. In that stage, you start to see art that adds no value, really. You know what I'm saying? Anything becomes art. Then you start to see that everything looks the same. There's really no true innovation happen. There's no new invention happen. So you start to kind of get a ceiling where you get innovation, but it's not new invention. It's just a replication or a little bit of an improvement on what came out of that golden era. So, I mean, this is just where we're at, man. And one of the biggest signs is the destruction of the family in the last phase. Because, again, leisure is what leads to a lot of these social problems. So as your society moves away from like hunter and gathering to the agrarian mode and into the industrial mode and now into a mode where technically, if you listen to some of the futurists, they could have already made most of us unemployed maybe 20 years ago because of the technology that they have chosen not to bring to the marketplace. But now because of COVID, they're bringing that technology forward probably 15, 20 years quicker than they planned on. So now that frees everybody from the kind of relationships that they needed. And now it's just more of a want and a desire. You see what I'm saying? So women were needed. Large families were needed in the pre-industrial age. And as we moved into the industrial age, less family was needed because most people were no longer farmers. You became an urbanized city. But unfortunately, people think that this is something new. It's not new, man. This is what happens with all civilizations. They go through a cycle and they lose the mission that they had. So that's just where things are with marriage. Women want to be free. Men want to be free. And the men that had the power to stop it didn't stop it. Ronald Reagan, his generation, had the power to stop it. But the climate and the spirit of that times was let these women be free. And then they had strong arguments to women. They said these men are abusive, they're cruel, they're abandoning us, and why do we have to stay in these relationships? And there had, I mean, this shit is crazy, but you got to think about it. Those men have mothers too. They had fathers too. And there were that argument being brought to them by these white women. They were raised by white women, so they were soft for it. So they were like, okay, my father was a drunk. Yeah. My father, he was a philanderer. Okay, yeah, we agree with you. My father left us. So what about these politicians that their fathers left them as a child? So you got to understand, every moment has its own energy, man. We're in one of those moments right now where there's a spirit overtaking society right now. I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I'm looking at the Portland situation. We're in a very Civil War kind of climate, man. You saw what happened in Portland. How no one would ever thought that federal troops would be throwing gas canisters at the heads of city mayors. No one would ever thought just a year ago that you'd have mayors being shouted down and run out of their own cities by regular people. No one was talking about defunding police departments on a mainstream level a year ago, but we've entered that moment of confusion and chaos where there's a fight between overthrowing the current social institutions and law and order status quo. That's the moment that we're kind of in right now. So marriage is no different. It's an institution that reflects the climate of its times. And so you can say all you want to a man should do it for this reason and that, but it's really about the women, the whole marriage thing. Women have to want to meet what most men that are in their peak ages want. It doesn't matter what a 60-year-old man or a 70-year-old wants for his daughter. Okay? It doesn't matter. What matters is that the men in society socialize the kind of daughters that men want to marry. And men aren't stupid. Older men know what's up. They know if they and their partner that they chose failed to raise the kind of daughter that can meet the times. Because again, with things being as open and people having the options that they have today, you got to raise a daughter and a son in a way it takes an incredible parent to raise a civil-minded, aspirational child in this day and age, man. Because there's so many different messages coming from so many different institutions against the family. So I salute the fathers out there who are able to raise daughters that they know that they can be proud of, that are not trying, that do not have the thought model as their model of behavior. And unfortunately, too many women have the thought model as what they want to aspire to until they get to be about Jada Pinkett's age, because she proved this whole idea of it being like 30, not in this generation. You got Jada Pinkett competing to ride the cock carousel of her 20-year-old children's friends. That's some serious shit, man. That's serious business, bro. Because the young people have to have someone to look up to, man. How can you look up to your uncle if he's trying to fuck your bitch when she comes to the family reunion, bro? Think about that for a minute. That has impacts. Now, again, I'm for a free market. If my uncle take the woman that I'm with, I'm going to congratulate him and say, damn, she ain't shit. You got her, unc. But it has repercussions in terms of trust between generations and containing those family bonds, man. So we don't want to talk about what happened between Jada and Will to the extent it is, not just because they're celebrities, but because what that model represents, bro. It represents the young people can't look to the older people because they don't look at them as their elders, but they look at them as their peers. And even some, they might even look down on their parents, saying that I'm more mature than my own mother or father is. I bring my date home and my father's trying to fuck her. I bring one of the friends over to play PlayStation 4 and my mom's trying to bang my homeboy. Shit, I'm sitting here. I'm on Fortnite. The homie go to the back room to say he going to the restroom. He been going for about 30 minutes. I come back. He's sweating like a motherfucker. Mom's is in the shower. What happened? Do we understand what the impact is on a Gen Zer like Willow and Jaden? We don't know what the impact is, man. So again, these all things are factors. And it would be one thing if this wasn't in your face every day, all over the television, everywhere. They're promoting this, man. The cougar. They're promoting that shit heavy, man. And we're not thinking about the repercussions for what young people will think of their parents when they just can't trust them because they're acting like juveniles. They're 50, but they're acting like they're 23 years old. And the reason they're acting like that, because they say that marriage put me in a situation where I couldn't even actually explore like I wanted to. And then they go to explore and find out that the grass ain't necessarily greener on the other side. Because that's what ends up happening. These women had quality men in their life. It ain't like these women don't got quality options. They do. Women got way more options than men. I mean, it's just unbelievable the options women have had. And I'm not just talking about now because of the internet. When was it that women didn't always have more options than the average man? They always had it. They were just limited to their jurisdiction because of the technology, but they still used, the average woman still always had more options than the average man. It's been like that for a long time. So let me see what the brother Xanatos said, because I'm gonna be on for about another 5 minutes. I'm gonna get up out of here. I just wanted to drop this, but I know Ed said that he was like at work or something, and he might be able to come through, but he kind of prompted me to do this conversation because I think it's important that the men that are actually in their peak marriage age range, that we speak on this, because we're the ones that will or will not get married, and we have to understand reasons why. But for me, again, like I said, I'm not against marriage. I'm for marriage if you can find a woman that meets a high ass standard in this climate. And I enter that knowing what the odds are. Just like I wouldn't want to enter a business without knowing all my market research. I know what the time frame is. I can look at my past relationships. And, you know, it's like, okay, but still, there's still reason that you might want to get married because this woman meets you on your class level. Look at, man, I've been in relationships. I've been single. We've all been there. You know what I noticed? When you're single, the longer you're single, the more you start wanting the woman around, right? And then when you get that woman around, the more you start wanting to be single. And the same thing happens to women until you get to a point where I guess you've been there, done that, right? And that's why people are getting married so much later now. But, you know, nothing lasts forever in any state of mode. Everything is temporary, right? Everything is evolving. And I just think that that's just where we're at right now, is that if you can get those things from a woman that you want, then and you understand the condition. I'm not going to try to sell you on something a lie. It's like trying to sell toothpaste to somebody. And I don't want to use the toothpaste. You see what I'm saying? What did Scarface, the dude in Scarface, when he told him, he said, don't get high on your own supply, right? And so a lot of people are selling things that they're not buying themselves. Me as a man and black man in America, we're at a point now where we can't tell lies to other black men, bro. We got to give each other the truth. And that shit hurts sometimes. It hurts to know that most brothers will have a hard time finding a compatible woman and having a long-term relationship with her in 2020. But that doesn't mean that you don't keep living. If something comes along, knowing you got the truth, okay, I know that this is the possible outcome. I know that this is the likely outcome, but I'm still going to jump in because you know what? You only got one life to live. The average age of death for black men in America has increased in the last 20 years from like 65 to 72 now. So basically, that puts middle age for a black man around 35 years old. So for a black man, once you reach 35, that's middle age now. And some men they might just choose to say, hey, I know what the chances are with this. I'm tired of being single and casual, and I want something, you know, a little bit more stable, just a little bit more. And then, you know, that's just reality, knowing that in this current climate, unless the rules change, which I doubt they will, that's just what we're dealing with. So Xanatos says, what you just said is the reason why nursing homes aren't going anywhere, despite the COVID pandemic. A lot of these elders are setting themselves up for just that. Yeah, I mean, that generational animosity is not a normal thing, man. You're supposed to respect your elders, but respect is something that's earned. And I just don't see how more people don't see what I saw with that Will and Jada situation, man. I'm not hearing the kind of conversation. I saw something different. I saw why so many younger people don't respect the other generation. And that's just one thing, you know, seeing them trying to fuck their friends. But, you know, the other generations did a lot of damage to young people, man, but they never take responsibility for it, dude. And I always said when I come on these streams about how I saw it in my community, where I saw people, they thought it was okay to exploit each other, man. Exploiting each other was a good thing. Selling crack, as long as you got that money, it didn't matter if you sold that crack to one of your own relatives. And this was the kind of moral code that was implemented for a lot of people that are in their 20s and 30s today. They saw this growing up, man. They lost a lot of respect for older people because of a lot of reasons. But no one wants to be held responsible for, oh, it was someone else that did it. Oh, it was this reason. When the truth is, we need to just be accountable for what has happened and what is continuing to happen. Millions and millions of people saw that situation with Will and Jada, and now they're seeing the same thing with Kanye West and Kim Kardashian's imploding marriage right now. Where are all these great examples of successful marriages for people that are in their 20s and 30s? So let's not talk about the 60 plus people who managed to hold on. I'm talking about for young people that are in their 20s and 30s that were raised by people that would now be in their early 60s and their early 50s to early 60s. Where are all these great role models that they've seen? So that's another important part. And so for us, now that we are in peak marriage age, and now that we will be the next generation to have power in another decade, we have to determine on what kind of role models that we want to be. I know for me personally, I try to strive towards self-actualization. I try to be someone that has like a certain kind of moral code based on stoicism, because these are the kind of things that I'm attracted to. I'm not a religious man, but I just believe in the basic rule of treat people like you want to be treated. But the second thing that I believe a lot in, be the change that you want to see. So whatever you say that the standard that you want is, you need to be proven to other people that that standard works and that it's applicable to reality. Hope ain't feeding nobody out here, dude. Hope ain't paying no bills out here either. And hope damn sure ain't gonna keep a man or a woman around in a relationship they don't want to be in. The only thing that will is practical socializing of children and practical results in a chaotic, dynamic environment. If whatever you're selling can't meet that, then you're just selling hope in a bottle like they sell air. You know, they got like people that sell bottles of air and shit. That's what you're selling. You're selling something that's free out here already, or either it's just like a dream. And I think that that's something that the younger black men, that we have to step up and have these conversations. We have to put the real information out there. You know, I was saying on another panel the other day about how our society is being dumbed down. And they're actually pushing the idea of dumbing down society because of you black asses. You black men, they're disrespecting you every day out here, man. I'm watching television and they're saying we got to lower the scores on reading and letting people in the college because black men can't read and write. We got to lower down the speech test scores because black men can't say a coherent sentence. We got to lower the standards on everything because they're saying that black men can't meet the standard. Black men, you're dumb. You lack reasoning. You lack skill and competency. That's what they're saying right now. And you got people cheerleading this shit, man. They're cheerleading little John in the kindergarten, saying that, you know what? That's white people's values reading. Don't worry about that, little John. It's about feelings. I literally have heard this in the last week, man. White and black and other races of academics saying that logic, linear thinking is white values. We've heard this before among blacks, but this is the first time I've ever heard other races jumping on this thing. So that means this is where we're going. We're getting rid of the ACT. We're getting rid of the SAT. We're getting rid of all standards because black men can't perform at this level. And you got black people cheering with these people, while I don't see the Asians are sitting in the background like, yeah, this is going to be good. The new immigrant Latinos are like, yeah, this is going to be good. Because they know that while everyone else is accepting lower standards, they're going to keep their standards high. And they're going to be the ruling groups. If America even exists in 50 years, they will be the ruling class. They're setting black men. Black women are already kind of in a bad situation because of how they've not raised their sons correctly and invest in their sons. But black men, it's your turn now. You are all over the news right now as a victim and a proxy for other groups. But what they're not talking enough about is how them lowering the standards for you is going to actually be the standard so that all these new immigrants can step right over your ass without even looking sideways. Because that's lowering the standards actually benefits new arrivals more than it will ever benefit black men. Black men don't need lower standards. We need higher standards. We need to lean into what they call white people stuff. Thinking for ourselves, independent thinking, creative thinking. We should be leaning into that shit while everyone else is trying to tell you not to. They're selling you another dream. So just like they weren't against black men in the 60s and 70s, everyone's against black men today. They're setting us up for failure, man. And it's sad because it's not going to be you and I that suffer because of it. Matter of fact, the UN just announced, and this is a shout out to the Professor Hassan, because I was listening to his stream, and he mentioned that the UN is now about to pass a refugee asylum for American black men next year. So the black men that are adults right now, we're good. We're going to have more options than ever. But it's going to be those children, the young black boy that's in Generation Alpha, he's in trouble, man. He's in deep trouble. And that's just where we're at. So for me, again, I'm for marriage if you can find you a woman that's feminine, that she's attractive, that she gives you deference, that she cooperates with you, she's loyal, she comes from good breeding. And when I look at her, I say, you know what? This is what the DNA I want to mix my bloodlines with so that we can have a boy or a girl that carries on our legacy. So if you can't get that, then marriage don't really make a lot of sense to me no more. Because again, cohabitation, as the article coming straight from the CDC said, that's the standard. So I'll just read those last numbers and I'm gonna get out of here, fellas. But I did kind of want to show you the actual numbers that they had in the article from the CDC, from their actual study. And we can just kind of leave it on that note. So let me bring that up real quick. So here are your actual marriage data from the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services, the last report that studied the last 18 years. So as we see here, the year 2000, the American population was around 281 million. It was about 2.3 million marriages. And so you see from the year 2000, it starts to go down, right? Even while the population is going up. So think about that from like visually. So while the marriages are going down, the population is increasing. I mean, there was a huge increase in population in America in the last 18 years because of the immigration failures. Just look at how that population has jumped tremendously from 2000 to now we're in 2020 to from the marriage rates. So it's been steadily going down, and we know that it flattened in around 2009, and then it picked up again here in 2013. So these are the numbers. So the last time the report came out in 2019, so they were looking at 2000 to 2018, and they produced this document over the last year before COVID. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen post-COVID. But so here we were in 2018, a population of 327 million with only 2.1 marriages. So that's where we're at. So those are your statistical facts. Now, what you guys want to do with it, that's up to you. But I hopefully I brought a good conversation about the topic. Shout out to OG Bobby Johnson. He said, repeat what you said about the UN refugee status. Yeah, so basically the UN, because of like the racial terrorism and the police brutality against black men, we're actually getting our own like category as a refugee coming very soon, most likely sometime early next year. So we'll be able to get refugee asylum in the United Nations that sign up for the program. And if you guys know, that comes with certain benefits for new arrivals. So let's say you're a black man here in America and you want to actually move to somewhere like London or Canada. Now you qualify under a refugee program for asylum. And that comes with certain benefits like free education, free language training, help with your rent, help getting a job. It comes with a lot of benefits to help you adjust to the country. This just happened. It was on Dr. Hassan's stream and I looked it up and I read the article. Shout out to the brother Sigma Jones. He says tomorrow I'll be doing a stream about the UN refugee status and the implications from it. So there you go. So Sigma Jones, go ahead and put your link to your stream before I get off so that people can find you tomorrow, because he's going to be breaking down that document. Dr. Hassan, he didn't break it down. He just introduced it because he was doing like a bigger conversation on gynocentrism and misandry. But Sigma Jones is going to be doing a breakdown of what that program is, how it's going to work, and how you might qualify. So a lot of black men are going to be expatriating from the United States over the next decade or two now that this program is going to be put in place. This shit is going to get real. And again, like I said, it's unfortunate for the young generation alpha black boys that there is going to be a brain drain amongst, I don't know what the percentage will be that would actually, maybe it's only 5%, maybe it's 10, I don't know. But again, my point is that it's another option that black men have that their fathers didn't have, that their grandfathers didn't have, and their great-grandfathers didn't have. So now the black man in America in his peak marriage age has another option that's about to be introduced. So I don't know what to tell you about the Western marriage, man. That's the best argument that I can make. You guys got something to think on now that you know the actual stats. One of the things I would say is that with COVID, as we've seen with other countries that are now opening up, that they're seeing that boost in divorce, man. So while Sigma Jones gets his link for you guys before I get off here, I'll see if I can pull the story up first from ABC while he does that, and then I got to get out of here, man. So we'll pull up the recent article on it. So, all right. So let me bring this up real quick. And I appreciate you guys all coming through, man. I love having these conversations with you all. It's definitely a way for me to develop my own ways of thinking about things. So I appreciate that. Okay, so here's an article that I was reading in preparation. This is also from April at the peak of quarantine. And this one from ABC News, it says, surge in divorces anticipated in wake of COVID-19 quarantine. A wave of divorce filings is expected to break across the country when COVID-19 confinement ends, according to several divorce attorneys. While access to courts is now limited, when those restrictions are lifted, I have no doubt that there will be an overwhelming number of filings, said New York divorce attorney Marcy Katz. In Chicago, family law attorney Robert Siegel expects a deluge of divorce cases. This is what we are hearing around the country, says Susan Myers, president of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. We are fielding calls right now from people who are tired of being in the same house with each other. Boom. We are fielding calls right now from people who are tired of being in the same house with each other. In jurisdictions that have shut down their filing system, she senses there will be a rush to the courthouse when operations resume. Tension bred by forced proximity. Now we're talking about married people, brothers. Married people. Tension bred by forced proximity is only one reason cited for a spike in divorce after the COVID-19 crisis. Katz has found that it may also be due to the fact that people are coming to terms with their mortality and want to make positive changes in their life. That's deep. So this lawyer, she's saying that these people see their marriage as a hindrance to their self-actualization, and they discovered this during the lockdown, and they see it as a positive thing now to leave their spouse as soon as the states open back up, which probably won't be into the end of the year, if not next year. Siegel puts what he sees, now this is another attorney, Siegel puts what he sees in a broader context. We are living in a polarized society, he said, and that extends to the home. People are less willing to compromise, less willing to work things out. See, now there's a reason why, and Siegel doesn't really point that out. He says people are less willing to compromise, less willing to work things out. One of the major reasons for that is because they can choose to leave so easily now. They used to have restrictions in place that forced them to compromise. Family stigma, community stigma, state stigma. Those safeguards are gone now, so people are less likely to compromise on anything and much more likely to walk away. And then he added that financial stress combined with confinement is also pushing some marriages to a legal and physical breaking point. Myers paints a vivid picture behind some of the calls the divorce attorneys are getting now. If you are stuck in a little apartment and one of you has been laid off, or maybe both of you have been laid off, and you've got kids and it's loud and you're tired and everybody is on high adrenaline fear, if you don't have good coping skills, it's not surprising that domestic violence is on the rise. But togetherness forced by stay-at-home orders has in some cases led to resolution rather than dissolution. On Tuesday, for example, a couple in the process of getting a divorce told Myers that being stuck together brought them to resolve they were going to stay together. So we dismissed their case. If the expected breakup surge does happen when stay-at-home orders are lifted, it would be the opposite of current trends. Forecasts of a divorce spike are based on attorneys reporting a surge in inquiries, plus a rise in filings where electronic submissions are permitted. But divorce lawyers are hesitant to put numbers with the prediction. So that's that. Let me see if the brother put his link in there. So the brother's Darius Harper. I appreciate that, man. He says, good to have you back. Yeah, man, I always enjoy, dropping in from time to time and having these conversations with you all. D-Max says, I just mentioned in the chat that your African-American museum is now claiming that it is part of white culture to be patriarchal. Yes, that's what I was talking about, D-Mac. That's exactly what I was talking about, that case with the African-American Museum, where they were trying to say that if you believe in a scientific method, logic, a nuclear family, they're saying now that you're white. Google African-American Museum and white values, and you'll know exactly what D-Mac's talking about. That's what I was referring to. After reading, I was like, this is crazy. We already had the incident with black people saying that for years, that if you believed in these things, that you were white. Now, the white people themselves are saying that those are white people's values, because black people, they're saying that black people don't have the values of logic, even though blacks were the original mathematicians, and even though the Western philosophers studied under the black and non-white philosophers before Western society took off. Now we're being told that we're naturally emotional and some kind of astrological thinking people, that we're not capable of creating logic. We're not capable of creating constitutional republics ourselves. Those are white values. Black people are emotional and creative. That's what they're saying. And you got black people cheerleading and stuff. It's just unbelievable to me, man. It's just unbelievable that in 2020, blacks are cheering the idea of being told that you're inferior in terms of creating culture and civilization. I don't know how we got to this point this quickly, man. But hey, that's just where things are. So let me see. Did he put the link in there for you guys? Okay, so Sigma Jones just put the link in there for you all. That's going to be the conversation related to that article that Dr. Hassan mentioned about black men receiving refugee and asylum status. So now we're at that point now where black men are going to be defined as their own group, and black American women are going to be defined as their own group in the next year or two. So that time has already arrived now. And where we go from here, it's going to be up to you all, man. The future is yours. It's the old people's time has come and gone. The future is yours now. And you're going to have to determine on what you want and what you don't want. And it's going to have repercussions either way. So with that, I will leave you guys with the entanglement. Video, because that's funny as hell.
We're going to take our space, and what happened?
Yeah, and then I got into an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August,
An entanglement
an entanglement with August. I got into an entanglement with August,
an entanglement
with August, with August, with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August,
an entanglement
with August, with August, entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement with August, an entanglement, an entanglement.
And I am out. Everyone have a great Friday and a great weekend. And until next time, stay up and stay healthy, man.